You know that feeling when you try a recipe from a famous chef? You follow it to the letter, but it just doesn't turn out right. Something's missing, right? Maybe it's a secret ingredient or some little technique they just didn't write down. It's so frustrating. Well, today we are diving into that exact same problem. But it's happening somewhere you'd never expect, at the highest levels of business research.
So think about it. What if the studies that guide huge, multi-million-dollar business strategies are based on methods so secret, so hidden, that nobody else can even check the work? It's a massive question, and honestly, the answer we're about to uncover is, well, it's pretty shocking. Okay, so to get our heads around this, you need to know there are kind of two main flavors of research. First, you've got quantitative research. That's all about numbers, statistics, big surveys, stuff you can measure precisely. And we've all heard about the replication crisis there, right? Where scientists can't reproduce lab results. But our story today is about the other side of the coin, qualitative research. This is all about the why. It's about deep conversations, case studies, and really understanding context. And it turns out it has a massive transparency problem of its own. So let's start with a little symptom check. We hear a ton about the crisis in number-crunching science, but what's really going on with the research that's built purely on conversations?
Look, the ability to replicate or reproduce a study's findings, that's the absolute bedrock of scientific trust. If you can't rerun the recipe and get something similar, how do you even know the first result wasn't just a total fluke? And this isn't just a problem for beakers in a lab. It is a huge issue for research that relies on talking to some of the most influential people on the planet.
And that brings us to a really important term for our explainer today: elite informants. This is just the fancy academic name for the people researchers talk to at the very top. We're talking CEOs, board members, top execs. These are the people whose insights are pure gold because they see the whole picture. Their decisions literally shape entire industries. So when research is based on these one-of-a-kind conversations, it's even more critical that we can trust it. But how do we know if we can?
Well, this is exactly what a couple of researchers, Herman Aguinas and Angelo Solarino, wanted to find out. They saw all these symptoms and decided to build a proper diagnostic tool. They wanted to create a systematic health check for this kind of research to see just how transparent and, how trustworthy it really is.
And believe me, their process was seriously rigorous. This wasn't just some gut check. First, they dug through over 140 different academic sources on research quality, from management, sociology, you name it. From that huge pile of knowledge, they pulled out about 40 potential things a good study should probably report. And then, they whittled that list down to the 12 absolute core essential principles for transparency. 12. That's the magic number. 12 checkpoints that any piece of qualitative research should be able to pass, no problem, to prove that its recipe is not a secret. These criteria cover the whole shebang, from how a study was designed to how the data was actually analyzed. So, what are these 12 criteria?
Let's just look at a few examples to get a feel for what this checklist is all about. It asks really simple but totally crucial questions. For research setting, it's like, did the paper actually paint a clear picture of the company they were studying? For sampling procedures, did they spell out why they chose to interview these specific executives? A huge one is saturation point. That's the moment when doing more interviews doesn't really teach you anything new. Did the researchers explain how they knew they hit that point, or did they just kind of stop when they felt like it? And finally, data disclosure. Did they make their interview transcripts available for others to see?
So with their 12-point diagnostic tool ready to go, the researchers were ready to run the test. They were about to put top-tier management research under the microscope, and the results of this health check are, well, they're nothing short of stunning.
All right, so they took 52 different studies that all used interviews with these elite informants, and they were all published in the super prestigious Strategic Management Journal. They applied their 12-point checklist to every single one. So I want you to take a guess. Out of 52 of these top-tier studies, how many do you think passed the transparency test? How many were clear enough that another researcher could actually replicate their work?
And just to get the scale here, we're talking about 52 published articles. All of them peer-reviewed, all of them in a leading journal. They basically represent what we think we know about strategic management. So the big question is, what number goes behind that question mark?
0, not 1. Let that sink in for a second. Out of 52 top-tier studies, not a single one provided enough information to be properly replicated. In every single case, the recipe was a secret. The very foundation for trusting these findings, the ability for another scientist to check the work, was completely gone.
And look, this wasn't just them failing on some tiny, obscure points. Get this. For explaining how they chose their interviewees, only 6% of studies were fully transparent. For explaining the saturation point, that crucial moment where you know you have enough data, 0%. Not one study explained it properly. And disclosing the raw data, the actual transcripts, a measly 4%. This was a complete systemic failure of transparency across the board. Okay, so the diagnosis is grim, but any good diagnosis should lead to a treatment plan. The researchers didn't just point out the problem, they laid out a super clear blueprint for recovery. A real path toward healthier, more trustworthy research.
And the fixes are actually pretty straightforward, covering how research gets designed and reported. For the design phase, it's about basic context. Just state your method clearly, describe the company and its culture, and admit if you're an insider or an outsider. This context is everything. Then, for data collection, it really just boils down to showing your work. Be totally explicit about why you chose your interviewees, define how you knew you had enough data, and please don't hide the messy parts. If something unexpected happens, report it. Real research is messy, and being transparent about that mess is what builds trust. And finally, for the analysis, be clear about how you interpreted all those conversations and how you came to your conclusions. But really, the ultimate step? Make the raw data available. Let people see the recipe for themselves. That is the ultimate act of transparency, and it lets anyone follow your work from start to finish.
So what does all this mean for us, right? Why should we care about some academic papers not being transparent? Well, the prognosis for the future of business really depends on getting this right.
This quote from the researchers gets right to the heart of it. Businesses read these studies, and they implement real-world strategies based on what they find. They change how they operate, how they manage people, everything. But if the research they're basing these huge decisions on is built on a secret, untestable recipe, can they really expect to get the same results? Probably not. It really just comes down to a simple chain of logic. Transparency is what allows us to verify things. Verification is what builds trust, and trust is the foundation of all knowledge, in science, in business, in our daily lives. When even one link in that chain breaks, the whole structure just gets wobbled. This whole explainer has been about research, but the core idea here is universal. The simple act of showing your work, of sharing your recipe, is what allows other people to trust you, to learn from you, and to build on your ideas. It really makes you wonder, from our institutions to even our own relationships, where else could a little more transparency make a world of difference?